Buenas noches desde esta Washington que nunca pareció tan vacía, donde los pasillos del poder imperial resuenan con el eco de un imperio descubriendo sus propios límites, no a través de la derrota militar, sino a través de la evaporación gradual de su capacidad para intimidar a vecinos que durante 2 siglos consideró propiedad personal. Estoy observando algo que no ocurría desde la crisis de los misiles cubanos. América confrontando la realidad de que su patio trasero ya no le pertenece exclusivamente. La llegada de buques rusos a México no es solo cooperación naval bilateral, es colapso simbólico del sistema hemisférico que Estados Unidos construyó cuidadosamente desde 1823, cuando James Monroe declaró que el hemisferio occidental era zona de influencia exclusiva americana. 200 años después, Vladimir Putin acaba de demostrar que la doctrina Monroe se transformó en nota de pie de página de la historia. Lo que presenciamos no es simplemente changing of the guard hemisférico, es el momento exacto en que la hegemonía global americana se fragmenta irremediablemente, porque si Estados Unidos no puede controlar su propio vecino inmediato, ¿qué puede realmente controlar en un mundo donde poderes serios coordinan resistance para pressure imperial? Es Napoleón retornando de Rusia, pero en versión hemisférica. Imperio discovering que overextension tiene consecuencias cuando adversarios poseen capability para exploit vulnerabilities. Para comprender la magnitud de este colapso imperial, debemos de construir las fundaciones psicológicas de la dominación hemisférica americana. Desde 1823, élites americanas construyeron identidad nacional basada en la premisa de que Américas constituía sphere de influence natural que justified interference unilateral en nombre de security nacional e stability hemisférica. Esta narrativa funcionó razonablemente mientras América poseía overwhelming power advantage sobre cualquier combinación de adversarios hemisféricos. Durante Guerra Fría, América pudo intervenir en Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, Granada, Panamá, porque União Soviética no posuía capability para effective counterintervention en Western Hemisphere. Pero el mundo cambió fundamentalmente. Rusia rebuilt military capability e se tornou global power com reach oceânico. China desenvolveu economic partnerships que offer alternatives para American dependency. Irã criou networks de cooperation que bypass American financial control. Resultado: American threats no longer automatically credible porque potential targets possuem alternatives que didn't exist durante Unipolar era. Mexican decision para welcome Russian naval presence tests this new reality directly. México não está isolated target que can be intimidated through economic pressure e diplomatic isolation. Mexico é sovereign nation com global partnerships que provide alternatives quando American relationship becomes coercive rather que cooperative. Es realidad check que destroys foundational myths de American exceptionalism aplicados para hemisphere control. La cronología de este colapso imperial se lee como case study sobre cómo hegemonies end, no a través de dramatic defeat, mas a través de gradual erosion de credibility, cuando threats no longer produce submission. Último año, Biden threatens México sobre migration policies. México mantén policies. Último mes, Austin amenaza a México sobre energy cooperation con Rusia. México expands cooperation. Esta semana, Russian warships anchor in Mexican waters. América cancela threats y shifts para diplomatic dialogue. A classic imperial impotence disguised como policy sophistication. America discovering its traditional tools de hemisphere control, economic coercion, political pressure, implicit military threat, no function quando target possesses alternatives que make American pressure tolerable rather que determinative. Kimsenin konuşmadığı ama oyunu belirleyen detay ise şu, American intelligence agencies completely failed para anticipate speed and coordination de multipolar support para Mexican assertion de sovereignty. CIA briefings mentioned possible Russian interest a potential Chinese economic engagement, pero nobody predicted immediate Russian naval deployment seguindo Mexican invitation. As intelligence failure de epic proportions que demonstrates how disconnected American analysts became from actual global dynamics. They're still analyzing world através de unipolar lens, onde American actions generate passive reactions rather que proactive coordination. Reality es que multipolar world operates através de anticipatory cooperation. Russia, China, Iran não wait para American moves. Eles preparam counter moves em advance e execute them instantly quando opportunities arise. Es strategic coordination que operates faster que American decision-making processes. Intelligence failure reveals deeper problem. American establishment lost ability para understand como world actually works porque they've been living an ideological bubble on the American supremacy assumed rather que demonstrated through effective action. Bu hikayenin en şaşırtıcı kısmına şimdi geliyoruz. American response para Mexican-Russian cooperation triggered cascade effects throughout American power structure que revealed systematic weaknesses across all dimensions the hemisphere control. Military dimension, Pentagon descobriu que American naval superiority in Gulf of Mexico can be instantly challenged through Russian deployment de advanced warships. Decades the investment in regional military dominance became questionable quando serious naval power decided para project force in American waters. Economic dimension. Treasury Department realized que sanctions threats against Mexico became ineffective quando Russia provided alternative partnerships and China offered enhanced cooperation. Weaponized economics lost coercive power quando targets possess protected alternatives. Diplomatic dimension. State Department found que traditional hemisphere allies foram reluctant para support American pressure against Mexico quando facing possibility de similar multipolar opportunities for their own development. Colombian, Brazilian, Argentine leaders noting Mexican benefits. Intelligence dimension. CIA acknowledged que their understanding the Mexican intentions was completely wrong. Sources were unreliable, analysis was biased, predictions were inaccurate. As admission de professional incompetence at highest levels. As systemic failure across all instruments the imperial control simultaneously. Congressional hearings following Mexican-Russian cooperation revealed complete confusion among American policymakers about como operate a hemisphere que no longer accepts American dominance como natural law. Senators who spent decades demanding interventions as sanctions descubrieron complexity de modern international relations. Questioning the intelligence officials devolved into blame assignment rather que strategic thinking. Nobody wanted para acknowledge fundamental truth. American empire lost capacity para impose unilateral solutions a través de traditional imperial tools in its own supposed backyard. As political establishment discovering que job descriptions became obsolete quando empire cannot control immediate neighbors, much less distant continents. Asıl kırılma noktası burada başlıyor. Mexican defiance triggered broader reassessment the American hemispheric position que reveals systematic overextension without corresponding capability para enforce imperial commitments close para home, much less globally. American military bases worldwide saw now potential hostages rather que projection de power. Any conflict con Russia could trigger responses contra vulnerable installations que America cannot adequately defend. As imperial overstretch meeting coordinated resistance con predictable results. NATO expansion que seemed como strategic victory in 1990s now appears como massive liability quando facing Russian willingness para respond symmetrically in American hemisphere. Every European base hosting American troops could become target in broader conflict triggered anywhere. Economic integration con China, que seemed advantageous durante globalization, now creates vulnerabilities que Beijing can exploit whenever Washington pursues hostile policies anywhere. Supply chain dependencies became weapons that can be turned against American economy. Middle East partnerships that provided energy leverage now compete with Russian alternatives that offer stability rather than constant warfare. American fracking industry cannot compete with conventional production protected through military deterrence. As global position on the imperial commitments exceed imperial capabilities across all theaters of the operation. Financial dimension, the imperial collapse is particularly revealing in hemisphere context. Dollar's status como hemisphere reserve currency enabled decades the deficit spending que financed imperial operations throughout Americas. but dollar supremacy requires confidence in American power para enforce its value through credible threats. Mexican-Russian cooperation demonstrates que dollar-based coercion can be bypassed cuando major powers coordinate alternative payment systems. Russian energy transactions a través de Mexican banks using ruble settlements, Chinese trade finance para Mexican development a través de yuan credits, as practical de-dollarization happening in American backyard under protection de military deterrence. Financial warfare becomes ineffective cuando commerce occurs outside American-controlled systems protected through serious military power. Federal Reserve officials privately acknowledge que dollar hegemony depends on global acceptance rather que American enforcement capability. Cuando significant powers decide para abandonar dollar-based systems, Washington cannot force compliance a través de military action in its own hemisphere. Es currency supremacy revealed como voluntary arrangement rather que imposed dominance when tested a través de coordinated resistance. Hemisphere institutional dimension shows similar decay. Organization the American States, USMCA, Inter-American Development Bank, all institutions designed para legitimize American leadership, now face systematic challenge from alternative organizations que operat segundo different principles. CELAC expansion creates economic coordination mechanism que bypasses American-controlled hemisphere institutions. BRICS engagement offers infrastructure development que competes directly com traditional American aid programs. Russian cooperation provides military partnerships que reduce dependence on American security guarantees, as institutional competition on the multipolar alternatives often provide better terms que American-dominated organizations. Hemisphere countries have choices que didn't exist durante unipolar era. Choice enables independence from imperial pressure. American officials still speak sobre rules-based hemisphere order, como say these rules were natural laws, rather que artificial constructs designed para preserve American advantages. Multipolar world creates competing rule sets que reflect different values and priorities. As normative competition on the American exceptionalism sounds increasingly hollow para hemisphere audiences que have functional alternatives. Cultural dimension reveals additional weakness. Hollywood, universities, media organizations que projected American soft power hemispherically now compete como alternatives que offer different perspectives sobre hemisphere development y governance. Russian cultural programs, Chinese educational cooperation, Iranian medical partnerships, Cuban technical assistance, all provide alternatives para American cultural dominance. Monopoly and hemisphere narrative ended cuando audiences gained access para diverse viewpoints sobre same regional realities. American cultural dominance assumed natural superiority rather que market protection a través de barriers que prevent competition. Cuando barriers disappear, competition reveals American cultural products often inferior para alternatives que understand local contexts better, as soft power collapse disguised como cultural diversity y multipolar information environment reaching American doorstep. Mexican-Russian cooperation symbolizes broader imperial recognition the changed hemisphere reality. American threats are no longer automatically credible. American pressure can be neutralized a través de coordination. American isolation attempts can be reversed a través de alternative partnerships, as in the era on the single power could dictate hemisphere arrangements a través de combination de military intimidation, economic coercion y cultural dominance. Multipolar hemisphere operates a través de negotiation rather que submission, competition rather que vassalage. American establishment ainda não developed frameworks para operating in truly multipolar hemisphere, porque doing so requires acknowledging que American exceptionalism was temporary historical anomaly rather que permanent condition. A psychological adjustment que most of Washington establishment cannot make without questioning fundamental beliefs sobre American destiny y hemisphere role. From perspective, the Mexican port on the Russian warships anchor peacefully under Caribbean sun, American future appears fundamentally diminished. Hemisphere onde multiple powers pursue legitimate interest a través de peaceful competition, rather que single hegemon imposing arbitrary rules a través de violence y coercion. American retreat from Mexico no es just policy failure. A symbolic end the historical period cuando single nation could claim hemisphere dominance a través de military supremacy y economic leverage. New hemisphere era requires different skills. Diplomacy rather que intimidation, cooperation rather que domination, mutual benefit rather que zero-sum competition, skills que American establishment never developed porque never needed them durante a brief period de hemisphere supremacy. Mexican crisis taught fundamental lesson que will define American future. Imperial power without imperial capability, as expensive theater que convinces nobody in hemisphere que knows alternatives exist. Império descobriu seus limites através de small test com immediate neighbor. Implications são unlimited. Se America cannot control Mexico, what can it control in hemisphere on serious powers coordinate resistance para imperial pressure? Answer revela-se daily através de continued imperial retreats disguised como strategic pivots, policy reviews, diplomatic initiatives. As managed decline the hemisphere position, que can no longer be maintained através de traditional imperial tools. From Washington on the morning arrives com consciousness de reduced expectations e diminished possibilities. Império learned hard truth que previous empires descobriram antes deles. Hegemony has expiration date in hemisphere as everywhere else. A luta continua, mas luta has new meaning quando hemisphere participants operate como equals rather que hegemon-facing subordinates. As hemisphere que Mexico helped create através de successful resistance para último spasm de imperial control. Future as multipolar porque imperial alternative proved incompetent quando tested against coordinated resistance in American backyard. Incompetence, once revealed in home territory, cannot be hidden através de rhetoric alone.